Chief Guard of the Republic Radio Show with your co-hosts, Mike Tooman and Paul Burvid. Every Saturday, noon to 1, WRMN, 1410 AM, Fox River Valley Media Network. We're streaming live on WRMN1410.com. The studio number here is 847-931-1410. The magic text number is 505-926-1410. You can hit us up in the comments on the Facebook Live and the WRMN 1410's channel. How you doing, Paul?
Good. How are you?
Hey, we kind of ran out of time last week. We were going to do the amendments, and we only got through the Bill of Rights.
We did.
We did. So now we're gonna catch up. But I got a couple things to mention. One of our previous shows where we did on the treaties and two of the treaties and the annexation of territories into the United States. And what's interesting is, like, currently Greenland, Denmark, we talked about Greenland and the possible United States taking control over that through a treaty. Denmark has just put $2 billion additional dollars into the defense of Greenland. Denmark, a little country like Denmark, $2 billion. So that shows that just standing up and saying something, you get some actions done. And the other thing is that it's pretty much people know that the Chinese have absolute control over the ports that access both parts of the Panama Canal, and we're looking at that as a violation of the treaty that gave them back control of the Panama Canal. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of months on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
I know the Secretary of State went down to Panama recently, the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and he's talking to the Panamanians.
Yeah. Well, I hope he lets them know, that and explains to them that, like I said, I'm not being political. I try not to be political here, but the Chinese really aren't their friends. The Chinese are expanding.
Right.
And they will drop Panama in a heartbeat without even caring about if they left those ports unmanned and couldn't afford to maintain them anymore. They would absolutely drop them. It would be devastating for their economy.
For sure.
So now the original Bill of Rights actually had 2 additional amendments in it that did not pass, and those were I had it underlined here. So the 11th one, the 11th
was the compensation of Congress, which eventually did get passed as the last amendment.
Yeah, I know, the 27th. So that was the 12th Amendment, and the 11th Amendment prescribed a ratio representation to population in the House. No law so those didn't pass, right? But later on, in the 27th Amendment, it's amazing. But that wasn't passed in a constitutional convention. So the only amendments to pass in a constitutional convention were the Bill of Rights. Everything else was specifically by Congress and doing the 2/3 vote there. So the 11th Amendment, pretty straightforward, right? An individual cannot sue a state in a federal court. So if I live in
and it's meant for non-residents can't either. So it's to protect states from frivolous lawsuits.
Yeah, and to keep the courts from being over swamped with a bunch of frivolous lawsuits.
Right, overburdened. So then 12. The separate ballots for president and vice president. That came in 1804. So that was the last one out of this. I would say the initial amendments to the Constitution after the Constitution was ratified in 1791. Was that? Am I right about that? 1791. Yeah. Yes.
All right. So 1804. That's only 13 more years, and that's where they cast the ballots for the president first, the electors, according to the Electoral College, and then for the vice president. So they're not casting them both at the same time. So they elect the president, And okay, so they had this thing in Poland called Libre Veto, all right? And that meant that if one person, one of the nobility was there in the diet, right, and said he didn't want a law passed, he would just say veto, and one person can veto it. It's not like he's the president. You have to have 100%. And what they would do is if they knew a guy wasn't going to vote for him, and they really wanted it passed, they would either kidnap him, make sure he didn't show up, or flat out kill him, right? So if the president and vice president, if the president was elected and all of a sudden he just had a massive heart attack and expired, then you would actually elect, I guess the vice president would come in and actually be elected as president.
Right, and it was, and back at that time, it was when they ran, the guy who got the second amount of votes, even if he was from a different party, could be the vice president.
Yes, but they had to be from two different states.
That is correct, and they still do.
Yeah, they don't want one state to take over everything. So, or they didn't. Nowadays, you would think that they wanted California and New York to run everything. But okay, so the 13th Amendment, all right? So everyone, now you're talking about 61 years went by before your next amendment to the Constitution. So everything's running fine and happy. You know, we got the original 10 amendments plus 2, and then it goes 61 years, and Congress doesn't see a need to change any of this.
These next amendments you're referring to are what is commonly referred to as the Civil War amendments, because they came in the shadow of the American Civil War.
Yes, and the so the 13th Amendment. People think that it was the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, but it was not.
It wasn't.
It only freed the slaves in the secessionist states.
That is correct.
So people don't realize that there were slave states on the north: Kentucky, Maryland, and West Virginia. So all the slaves in those 3 states were not freed, only in the secessionist states. It took the 13th Amendment in 1865 to free the current slaves. However, it did not eliminate slavery, because it said you can still maintain slavery, and this comes to when you're talking about when you sentence a guy to prison and send him to hard labor, right? He's not getting paid for that. So basically he's a slave, right? Because he's in prison, he can't get out, and he's doing hard labor for the state. So the 15th, 14th,
13th.
13th, yeah. The 14th must be a real extensive one. All right, 13th. Neither slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime thereof. So you could still be sentenced to slavery. Oh, great. Can you put him on?
Hello, caller. Welcome to the show. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm sorry. I'm just listening. I thought I was going to be able to purchase certificates.
Oh, no. Shop Show has been discontinued until further notice.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
But I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for listening.
Did you want to ask the question?
No, she could have answered. She wanted to buy some tickets. We used to follow the Shop Show, which was a great show. But and it had a huge lead-in for me. But now we got the sports shows. I think those are a good lead-in, too. Those guys are great. Everything I know about Chicago sports is from the 2 shows that precede me. I listen to them as I drive in. So, so 13th Amendment, that came out there. And the next one is the
14th.
Yeah, the 14th Amendment. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number. That was the I believe the 11th Amendment that didn't pass, that came back in the 14th. But then it comes it also talks
about Section 3, the 14th Amendment, Section 3. And we realized this in the last election cycle where they're saying, oh, you know, you can't run for president if you've been an insurrectionist, right? So that's a very loose determination. Oh, if someone calls me an insurrectionist, am I an insurrectionist? If someone calls me president of the United States, am I the president of the United States? Okay, what's the definition and everything? And so there is, even though that was because of the Civil War, because all these politicians in the South that were still powerful, they still had money, they still had connections and everything else. They wanted to prevent the people that originally led the secession in the Confederate States there from acquiring power in the federal government. So they said, if you were one of these insurrectionists, you couldn't hold federal office, or you can no longer be in the federal military. However, if there's what did they say? The 2/3, if the Senate and the House of Representatives votes 2/3 to say, well, no, we're gonna waiver this guy. So where would that, if immediately after Civil War, one of the larger European powers decided that they were going to invade us and everything, and we decided that we needed more experienced generals than we already had on the North, and we needed to absorb some of these Southern generals in, then maybe the House and the Senate could have voted 2/3 to bring these generals back into active service from the South. That's how I can picture that having happened. What do you think, Paul?
Well, you know, I believe that happened during the Spanish-American War with General Wheeler, who I think was a senator at the time, and he was a former Confederate officer, and he became a general in the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, he would have had to receive that. Again, to be a senator, he would have had to receive the 2 votes of the House and the Senate to waiver him back in.
That's correct.
All right. So, and the other thing there, Section 4, saying that the federal government, the northern side, but now the whole thing, wasn't going to absorb the debts owed by the southern states to any foreign power.
Correct.
All right. So then we jump to.
Now, this is also important, though, in that it imposes now on the states a federal equal protection and due process. So prior to that, that was not actually imposed. So this made it, and they did that because of after Reconstructionist times. This allowed the federal government now to go in, and that's why they call it, you know, the Reconstruction Amendments, and to go into the states and empower the federal government to do some things into the states.
Yeah, because, you know, you could have, if you didn't have,
it came into effect in its own in the 60s, like forcing the U.S. Marshals to go, I think it was in Mississippi, to force Meredith going to school and things like that. And then they used this quite frequently in the 1960s for voting rights acts and things like that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's you don't want different states to have completely different voting requirements, you know.
Or turning it back on the federal government.
Yes.
As we're seeing again play out.
Yeah, because that's not going to work out well.
It didn't back then. It won't now.
People, you got to remember your history, man. You got to remember your history. You know, well, let's try this again. Well, it didn't work last time. Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat. But that trick never works this time for sure. Wrong cat. Yeah. Okay. So when we go down to the
The 15th Amendment, that's where they gave everyone, regardless of skin color, the right to vote. So long as
Not
you're over.
quite everyone.
No.
Because they had to make 2 changes a little bit after this.
You had to be citizen. You had to be a citizen. You had to be 21 years old, right?
Right.
And
a male.
And the male, yes. So then you go into the 16th Amendment, and that gets interesting now. I want to talk about that in a little more depth there. Is it gives Congress the right. Yeah, 60. It gives Congress the right to issue an income tax. Now, in the it makes it an amendment to the Constitution and makes income tax constitutional because it's an amendment. Before, what it was at Article 4, where the Congress has the right to issue levies, taxes, tariffs, and everything else. And today we're talking about tariffs and income taxes. The income taxes were not very popular. However, they think that it wasn't until 1913 that we had an income tax, and that is, again, untrue. Doing some research on that, I find out that President Lincoln issued an income tax during the Civil War. And that's only for the top, a very high percentage, a very small percentage of some very rich people, according to the Times, that they had an income tax. Now, later on, issuing the income tax here, it gives Congress this right. And so it says that they can have an income tax. It doesn't say that they shall or must have an income tax. It doesn't say what the income tax should be. So just because it's in there doesn't mean that Congress has to have an income tax. Now, when it comes to tariffs, nowhere in the original Constitution does it say that the president has the right to issue tariffs. But Congress has given the president rights over several laws that Congress had passed, specifically when Franklin Roosevelt took office in the 30s. There was they gave him more rights to issue tariffs, and then later on, President Kennedy had rights for national defense, so to issue tariffs to protect the nation. So it's very important that we have a steel industry in the United States for manufacturing and everything. And if people are sending in cheap steel, cheaper than we can make it and everything, then our steel industry will completely collapse. And that completely collapses, that's bad for our national defense. So they put tariffs on steel. They put tariffs on aluminum to make sure that these countries can't, even though they make it cheaper, it's going to cost them more. So we can still maintain our own productivity. And so over the years, the president has gotten more and more leverage, especially with this national defense thing, which again is very vague, right? Is this good for the national defense? Well, who's to say it's not, So
an interesting thing is, the Spanish-American War was funded by a tax on telephone, and actually it didn't get paid till almost 100 years after the war, and it was just funded through the phones.
Wow. I wonder what the interest was on that.
I have no idea, but I do know that tax was initiated to pay for our participation in the Spanish-American War, and it was not paid until almost at least 100 years later. It's very interesting how things worked out.
Yeah, well, there was a thing there, when we used to have war bonds and stuff, and the Civil War bonds, tariffs and everything. And to fund your wars, if you can just raise income tax on people and have your people working their butts off to fund a war that they don't want, or don't see any need for, if you're afraid that you can't pay for it, all right? If the defense contractors and the soldiers are afraid they're not going to get their money, you're going to think a little harder about going to war or sending soldiers in harm's way
or on how large your standing army has to be. So it just so the income tax there, a lot of people, economics and everything, they're screaming tariffs. Tariffs are going to be bad for us, and you're just going to be passing it on to the consumer. But you know what? If you're paying an income tax and you're not consuming anything, and then you got a person paying an income tax, but they're consuming everything, right? Well, pass it on to them because they're consuming things. You're not consuming things, you shouldn't have to pay a tax on that.
Right.
So like you said, a sales tax, right? And if you went with a flat sales tax on everyone, well, everyone's taxed equally because you're only taxed on what you purchase.
Like in Europe, they do it with the value added tax and things like that. Bless you.
Yeah, I always wondered what value added. What value does this tax add to the product I just bought?
They put it on there to pay for stuff.
Yeah.
And then it just costs you more.
Yeah. I was over in Germany and we had to fill out all these forms because we weren't technically German citizens, so we shouldn't have to pay these value added taxes when we went to buy something at the PX. And I was specifically for like cell phones, stuff like that. So then we go into sorry, excuse me. We go into the popular election of U.S. senators. And we had a troll on the social media, right? And I'm like, I says, we started to lose our republic when we had a popular vote for Senate. Because before then, it was the state legislatures. So you have a representative form of government or republic where people vote for their state legislature, their representatives from each of their state districts, and their senators from their state districts. And then these people within the state elect the senators. Okay, so you could have a very populous county such as Cook County, but how many state senators do they have? So it's kind of a balance. So if you're on an evenly balanced Republican Democrat, you have more likely in a legislature to vote one side or the other. But if you're a populist thing, it's straight by population, and Cook County is going to carry the day. So, okay, here we go. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the 17th Amendment. Cigarettes kill you slowly. It takes a lot to overdose on alcohol. You build up a tolerance for it. It happens. Some people get alcohol poisoning and they die. Very few, but a lot more have heroin overdoses. All right. But you have the prohibition there, and you immediately create a black market. And the black market is run not by honest citizens, it's run by criminals. And criminals get power because people want that little thing. And I think one of the things that happened here is some elitists said, wouldn't our country be so much better if if people didn't drink? And they had no intention of stopping drinking themselves because that's only for the little guys. The local police aren't going to come into my palatial estate and seize all my liquor. All right, so they make this they make the prohibition there because people are thinking highly of themselves, and it didn't really work out in the way they thought. What do you think, Paul?
I do, and I think it had a lot to do with the starting of the temperance societies and the Women's Temperance Union, which then kind of coincided actually with the next amendment, because I think that the women started mobilizing, and they it's like that old movie, Evil Alcohol, and I want to testify, and it I think the old Frank Sinatra movie, Robin and the Seven Hoods, but I think it had something to do with the women's rights movement, and they're mobilizing for temperance, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of Congress in the Senate, when they passed this amendment, were catering to
what they saw coming in as a voting block. They
That's correct.
for one of the rare times in history, they looked forward and they said, you know what? These women are going to get the right to vote. So we better do something to make sure that they're on our side. So it seems like I'm not saying all women or anything, but like you said, the temperance movement was
real big.
So they started that prohibition. And then, sure enough, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. And that's a 50% increase in your voting block. I think 51% increase, right? Because there's there's more women than there are men.
That is.
All right, so then the 20th Amendment, kind of boring, you know. Instead of March 4th, the president takes office on the 20th. So you have less time for the incumbent lame duck to cause more damage or whatever. And then we have the nice 20.
He got elected several more times after that, though, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now you got the 21st Amendment and the repeal of prohibition. So now when
it's the first time amendment was outright repealed by another amendment.
Yes, and the thing about this is, like, how do you put the cat back in the bag? Because now you create a criminal enterprise, a massive criminal enterprise based on a substance that people want, you know, that only the criminals have control of. All right? So it's not like you go to a dispensary and buy your ABC liquor like some states and counties have. You know, you go to
county-run liquor stores, actually, and state-run liquor stores.
Yeah, but it wasn't during Prohibition that you could go to these stores and buy this stuff. So you could only buy it from the criminals who made an ungodly amount of money, right, and had control and started to form an organization, right, hierarchy and control and stuff. And now you say, well, if we repeal Prohibition, we're going to take their main funding away from them. Well, if you lose main funding and you still have the organization, what do?
You got to switch to something else because you got to keep your guys working.
Yeah,
your crew has to get paid.
You don't get rid of the criminals just because of that, right? You know, no. They go to something else. They'll go
to rackets, maybe. Yes.
Prostitution, gambling, you know, drugs, anything else that's illegal. They're going to go, and that's what they know, illegal, right? So they're going to keep going. So that was a little bit too late, I think. You know, history will show that was a big problem, right? Then you got the next amendment where the president can only serve 2 terms, right? So I think people were getting tired of Roosevelt and the machine, the Roosevelt machine that was just going to get him reelected and reelected and reelected, even if he was on life support. You know, if they took his brain out and put it in a jar and they had one eyeball that could blink to say yes or no, you know, they would keep electing Roosevelt in. So Congress kind of scared of this having only one person in charge for so long.
Yeah, the emperor president, they didn't want that.
So they make it for 2 terms only.
Or no more than 10 years. So no more than 2 years of another term.
If you are already 2 years into the term of the president, 2 years into the term of the next president, then that counts as a full term. If you got 2 years left, if you got less than 2 years left, it doesn't count. All right. So yeah, less than 10 years. So you could do 2 terms, two and under a half. Right.
Right.
So and that fell on Truman was the first one that had an effect on. So he can only run.
Well, actually, I don't think it applied to him as he was there. I think it would have waited till the next election. If he would have got elected for that, he still would have been good, but it would have applied, I believe, to the next one after that.
All right. And so now we got the interesting thing now is that President Trump is coming, and he's the second president to be elected in non-consecutive terms. And so it doesn't say consecutive. It says 2 terms. So
correct.
If it was consecutive, then you could take 4 years off and then run again.
Correct.
But all right, so now the 23rd, that's kind of a boring one too. So we have the District of Columbia, and people say, "Oh, the District of Columbia should be a state," and I'm like, no, because you want a neutral place to have your head of government, and the founding fathers really thought of this, right? It's not part of Virginia, it's not part of Maryland, it's in between, and there's a whole thing on that. It's the District of Columbia. No state has control over it, but it also doesn't have a vote as a state. It doesn't have senators as a state. But now you have the citizens there. So they have the right to vote in a federal election. So I don't know how that works, because how did they get an elector in? I guess I didn't read that one.
Well, Washington, D.C. is really interesting because they don't technically have like what we have. They don't have a corporation council. They don't have a county attorney. All they have a mayor and a legislature, but their legal system is all federal. So they have a U.S. attorney who's the prosecutor, and it's kind of unique. It's in and of itself is very unusual.
But like
So all the crimes in D.C. are federal crimes. So if you ever get pulled over, you want to make a federal case on it, you would just move to D.C. Everything's a federal case.
Yeah, it's like all the traffic violations on a military base. Those all go to a federal magistrate.
Exactly.
All right, so then 24 is the anti-poll tax. So
correct.
So they can't charge you to vote. They can't say that you have to have land to vote. They can't say that you have to, be a business or anything, or to pass a test, be able to read and write in order to vote. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can vote if, you're at least 21 and a human being. All right, so then we go, that's another boring one,
Yeah.
Because then, you can make the federal laws, if you take and you shake out your demographics. If I get into office and I have a majority in both houses and everything, and I know I got a majority in the Supreme Court, right? I can have them push through a law that, based on demographics, is going to eliminate a lot of my opponent's ability to cast votes. All right. And so this basically says that you can't do that. Every citizen has the right to vote. Which the next one, we talked about this, the ascension of president. We already talked about this one in pretty much depth, in depth. Right. And that actually was pushed through by President Truman, because he wanted to have an absolute ascension system, because nothing was written in stone at the time. So it set it up that during this, they wanted to make sure that there were, at least other than the president and the vice president, that the two next people in line were actually elected officials, because the president's cabinet are not elected officials. But the Speaker of the House, all right, is an elected official, and so is the President pro tem of the Senate. Yeah, the majority leader of the Senate there. So they would have the Speaker of the House, President pro tem, and then you go with the secretaries in the order of when the cabinet positions were established. So the last cabinet position that has been established was the Department of Veteran Affairs became a cabinet position. So that's the last guy the last person in the ascension for president. So if it goes down to there's nothing after the head of the Department of Veteran Affairs. So I don't, the odds of it going that far are unlikely, and would it matter if it had to go that far anyways? So then the next, the shortest amendment to get approved before it was brought into the Senate, right, to get ratified. So
like, even though Congress votes through the Senate and votes through or the House, either one can introduce it and gives a 2/3 majority, it still has to be ratified by the state legislatures. Right? So the shortest one, which is impressive, was 10 March to July 1st of 1971. And that was giving the 18-year-olds the right to vote. So you look at that, that's March, April, May, June, July. That's like that's not even 6 months. 6 months before all the states ratified it. Now, you could say that was because of mass communication and everything else, but obviously everyone wanted 18-year-olds and up to vote. And rightfully so, because they had been fighting in our wars for a long time. Right? And then, of course, we talked about the 27th Amendment. You can vote yourself a pay raise, but you might not be in office to collect it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that.
And that's also the one that took the longest, because it was first proposed, as you said, in 1789, and it didn't get ratified until 1992.
Yeah, before then, Congress would just vote themselves a pay raise and then be like, they'd collect it right away. You know, and maybe they'd even make it retroactive or whatever for the beginning of their terms. But now, you know, you have to look at it, say, oh, they're going to vote themselves a 30% pay raise in a recession. And then, you know, the person that's going to run against them in the primary, especially for Congress, because they run every 2 years, is going to come and say, hey, you guys, you're out of your job. They raised your taxes, and, you know, inflation's out of control, and this guy gave himself a 30% pay raise. So he's going to think about that, because he's going to have to run for re-election. And if he doesn't get re-elected, he's not going to collect that pay raise. So what do I think so we finished up with all 27 amendments. And I think they're all great. It's great stuff here. And it shows that our republic and our Constitution are like it's like, I don't know who to
quote. It's a living document.
It can be a living document. It can change, right? But it's written in stone until it's changed. It's written in stone. So if it says it, it says it. If it doesn't say it, it doesn't say it. If you want it to say something different, write it, rewrite it in stone. Don't interpret it. Don't misinterpret something. That's why we got the Supreme Court saying whether it's constitutional or not. And like, I don't know who to attribute the quote to, but, you know, we have the absolute worst system of government in the world, except for all the rest. You know, it's like, you know, there is no government is necessary evil. All right, but we have the best necessary evil at this time, and I think we owe it to the Constitution, and we owe it to the ability to amend the Constitution to reflect the changing of the human condition. Yeah, so 8 minutes left. So, Paul, what do you think the next amendment to the Constitution should be?
Well, there's talk out there about this Equal Rights Amendment that's been pending around for about 25, 35 years, but we don't know. And there might be other amendments out there. I think they might try to actually codify this natural-born citizen thing and maybe make an amendment relating to that, I think. You know, I mean, something along those lines.
Yeah, you know, there is some vagueness to who is a citizen. Now, if you're a naturalized citizen, you weren't born here, right? If you're born here, were you born of citizens? That's the question. So you have birthright citizenship that says all you got to do is wash up on shore, have a baby, that baby's born on United States soil, automatically becomes a U.S. citizen. But the mother that gave it birth is not a U.S. citizen. You know, that's where all this stuff comes into play. You know, so there's I mean, recently we had the Chinese. There's some Chinese company that was flying Chinese women in to the United States that were pregnant, and they were getting them visas for whatever reason. They would fly into the United States. They would have their babies here, and they would have their anchor babies right here for U.S. citizens. So I could see a problem with that. I could see the communist Chinese government intentionally sending pregnant women over here to intentionally have their babies over there to give them U.S. status, right? And then later on, they have a lot of these automatically coming in because they have U.S. status. What do you think, Paul?
That is entirely possible. It's they call that the citizenship baby racket.
Yep. And I don't think any other country in the world allows that.
No.
So
no others do.
And it comes down to,
at least not any of the developed ones.
You go into the going way back where they say the president's going to invoke the Enemy Aliens Act, and that's for national defense. And if you could prove, and I could, if I was debating this, I would debate that is an issue of national defense, because how do you vet the parents? How do you vet their reasons for being here? What are the reasons for having the child here? So all sorts of interesting stuff. But one of the ones I'd like to see is absolute term limits. We got term limits on the president. I think we should have term limits on Congress.
That would be good.
I like what they say about the Mexican government. They only elect their president for 6 years.
Yes.
For one term. And they said,
right.
If you can't steal enough in 6 years, you don't deserve a second term.
That's correct.
And I think if these congressmen and senators can't steal enough in 12 years, that's it. Get your tin cup out and go begging for more money.
But then the question is, do you allow them to move from one house to the next?
Well, okay. Yeah, I think
so they get 12 and 12 in each one then.
Yes.
So they get 3 as 2 as a senator and 3 as a congressman. You're okay with that?
6 as a congressman and 2 as a senator.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, 24 years. But you know what? All right. So it's like a hierarchy thing, right? Senators don't usually get elected unless they have some other experience. A lot of them more recently just owed their loyalties to the party rather than to the states, and the party puts them in position. But 24 years seems reasonable, And if you're going to do a total, not consecutive, a total of 24 years in the House. Let's say you do your 24 years in the Senate and now you want to be a representative, because you do your 12 years in the Senate and now you want to be a representative. Well, okay, you get 12 more years. That's it. Right now, we got people that have been in over 50 years in the House of Representatives. They're not representing their congressional districts. You look at their congressional districts, they're garbage. They represent themselves. So I think that, some people might say, hey, 1 term for Senate or 3 terms for the House. I think 24 is reasonable. I mean, you could be 60 years old and do your 24 years and get out at 84, and you've had 60 years of life experience before you got that. Or you get elected very young at 21, and by the time you get out, you're 45.
Yeah.
So next week, I don't know what subject we talk about next week. I'm going we always have something that comes up. I think we talk about stuff that's
relevant and contemporaneous.
Relevant and contemporary, yeah. And I'm sure something will come up in the next couple of days that'll give me a subject to talk about. But hey, if you enjoy the show, call in, let me know, all right? And leave some messages. And as always, you can find all of our shows on our webpage, cgr.scilink.com. cgr.psylink.net. So cgr.psylink.net. All of our shows will have a link to the Chief Guard of the Republic YouTube channel, the YouTube channel, Chief Guard of the Republic YouTube channel, and all of our shows are up there if you want to go through them and sharpshoot us and hit us with questions next week.
Have a great week.
Thanks, Paul.
Want to read some action-packed, exciting pulp fiction? Read the works of Michael Tooman, now featuring their international crime thriller, I Married a Bot Madam. Available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle editions. The paperback is also available at other book retailers. Check out Michael Tooman's webpage at psylink.net. That's Papa, Sierra, Yankee, Lima, India, November, Kilo, dot, November, Echo, Tango. Join your co-hosts Mike Tooman and Paul Burvid on our weekly radio hour, Chief Guard of the Republic, where we talk about all things national security, defense, personal security, safety, and dealing with law